I want to give a quick thank you to our sponsors. This cafe is supported by the U.S. Forest Service and Illinois Department of Natural Resources Urban and Community Forestry Program. Their funding supports workshops and training so the Alliance can help more communities improve urban tree canopied forests and equity across the region, and including participation in Tree City USA. So please learn more by checking out their website. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bob Fisher and we can get started.
Thanks, Laura. Welcome, everybody. We've got a lot of content, so we're going to get right to it. The title is pretty descriptive of what we're going to be talking about, the threats to the migratory birds that travel through the Chicago area and the opportunities that exist for mitigating those threats. Next. I think we all know it intuitively, but the data suggests that the Chicago wilderness and Chicago region flyway is very important for neotropical migrants that
Sorry, Bob, I think I muted you.
I'll start again. The regional flyway that we're on is a very important flyway. This slide pretty effectively summarizes why it's important and the numbers of birds that we see migrating through the Chicago wilderness region is not an artifact of a lot of birders and bird conservation people looking. It is a very real phenomenon. And certainly there's an issue of unfriendly habitat that they have to pass through. But there's been a lot of research now that's enabled us to quantify quite effectively the large scale of this migration. Go ahead, Eric. So this speaks for itself. Through the Great Lakes, based on the application of weather radar technology to counting birds, if you will, one of the top experts in that area, Professor Jeff Bueller, suggests that 500 million birds pass through the Great Lakes every year going north, and then over 800 million come back. And that's, of course, including then the young birds that were born further north. Next. This is a pretty good indication. This is from works done by Professor Van Doren and
Oh, Bob, you're muted again.
Okay, what the work that this paper represents is that approximately, based on a 75-kilometer wide transect, that approximately 80 million migratory birds pass through the Chicago wilderness region every year along the west side of Lake Michigan. And in the spring, and then again in the fall, you have the return migration, and it's a larger scale migration in the sense that it again has the young birds that are accompanying the offspring of the birds that bred successfully up north. And the peak times are obvious from this graph. It's typically early May and then mid-September, and as many as 4 million birds can pass through the region in a single day. On to the next. Along with the weather radar, there's new technology now being used, developed largely by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is portable radar. And what that has allowed researchers to do is to more specifically identify the numbers of birds that travel across the lake and along the lake shore, but out over the lake. And the traditional weather radar doesn't define that as well as these portable radar stations. That's one shown on this slide here that allows you to go to a certain location and identify exactly how many birds pass there on a specific day or a specific week or a specific month. So it is a very useful additional tool so that we can quantify the number of birds that are passing by. And I think I turn it over to you, Eric.
Sounds good. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, with that, we want to give a little background about why migrant birds are so particularly important. I like to start out with this slide when we give a talk, which really just showcases how many birds are of concern right now. This is not just migrant birds, but 1/3 of all North American birds that are under urgent active conservation concern. And in that note, here's a couple particular species. So when we look at the boreal warblers, this data largely from Partners in Flight and other sources, we can see this trend over the past almost 50 years. And looking at the number of species that are in significant decline, shown in red here. Blackpoll warblers, a good example of one that's seen really dramatic declines. 1970, there were over 300 million. In 2017, that population was down to just 60 million. So this is someone birding in 1970 theoretically may have seen 5 times as many blackpolls as someone birding in 2017. And then just projecting out those trends, assuming they were still the same today, that number would already be down to 51 million. If we look at the aerial insectivores, this is species like swallows and flycatchers, birds that are catching bugs in the air a lot. You'll see almost every single one of these has dramatic declines over the past 50 years. Eastern kingbird, an example here, another species, 45 million in 1970, and down to 26 million or even 24 million today. And then finally, we'll look at sparrows real quick. Again, you'll see similar trends. Almost all these species seeing very significant population declines. We like to highlight Henslow's sparrows here as a little light in the dark as far as one that Chicagoland's really been doing a great job for, even though long-term they've experienced significant declines. They're really doing well and increasing in Chicagoland, largely thanks in part to the restoration efforts that people here are doing. So when we look at the migrant birds, we'll see that they're seeing a lot of similar declines of species overall. And with that, we wanted to kind of highlight some of the migrant birds of concern that are of particular importance. And this is a list that BCM developed, a group of people who got together, and it's largely based off of Partners in Flight scores, which are taken for the regions around Chicagoland, along with a couple other sources for birds that aren't covered by Partners in Flight. And many of these species migrate through the Chicago wilderness region in very high densities. Of those birds of concern migrants, there's a very big number of them that are woodland or shrubland birds. You'll see on this list Canada warbler, golden-winged warbler, Connecticut warbler, veery, black-billed cuckoo, blackpoll, which we talked about, Cape-Maine cerulean, all species that are common migrants in Chicagoland. Red-headed woodpecker is one that breeds here, but also migrates through the area. And these numbers in parentheses represent the score, where the higher is, the more concern we have for those species. So any of these species over a score of 18 to 20 or so are of pretty high concern in our region. And if we quickly compare that to other species, you'll see, we also have a lot of migrants in wetlands. Obviously, the Chicago Lakeshore has a lot of migrants, but many of the species of concern, these are very rare, small numbers of these birds that come through our region, or that they're more abundant in other parts of the state of Illinois. And then we also have a suite of some winter species that we can get in the Illinois area and still want to think about managing for. But today we're really going to focus on those woodland and shrubland birds because of the number of species that we can help and benefit through that. So as we talk about Chicagoland, Bob talked a little bit about some of the general things that we see for why Chicagoland is so important. Here we've got some more visuals for you that kind of really help drive that point home. These are animated maps that eBird has produced, and you can find these on their website and literally watch week by week. This will show you where each of these species is on its journey as it migrates north. So if you haven't checked this out, it's a really neat tool to look at. Here you can see how black-throated green is a species that's migrating up from the Gulf and coming around the western side of Lake Michigan. And if you animate this map, you'll see it even more so how this kind of moves along. And Cape May warbler, a species from the other side, also comes up through Chicagoland and will often circumvent around Lake Michigan. So while some areas may only get one or the other of these birds on these kind of different routes, in Chicagoland, we get a lot of birds from both directions that funnel through the area.
Eric, there was a question about what the colors represent on that map. Can you illuminate
This
that?
map, yeah, so purple would represent more dense area for the species. But again, as you watch the animation, it's more important just to kind of showcase, you'll see kind of this flow for where these birds are going as they go on their journey. So we've kind of drawn the lines there that show you how those colors move on the map when it's animated. Thanks for pointing that out. In addition to the different routes, Chicagoland's also very important for both rare species and common species. So in this case, here's Connecticut warbler. And again, remember, this is just a 1 week snapshot that we've taken here. So in 1 week, there's a big density of birds in Chicagoland, and they kind of follow this route up around the western side of Lake Michigan. This map, it may highlight some areas. We don't really know how much we assume eBird factored that in, that there's actually a population in Chicagoland. Obviously, that may be one where detectability and number of observers is having an impact on that too. But more, we just want to highlight, this kind of area that they're navigating through that comes up through Chicagoland. And then here's an example of a common species, but one where Illinois is really important. Sorry. And you can see here for palm warbler, again, this is just a 1 week snapshot, and look at the density of palm warblers that are coming through Illinois. Almost the entire state lit up purple. So these snapshots, someone was asking what the time period is. I believe we took different snapshots depending on the species, but it would be kind of like May 10th through May 15th, for example, for palm warbler potentially. And Connecticut warblers a little later, like May 15th to May 20th was probably the snapshot for this one. And again, looking at the population sizes here, so Connecticut warbler, only 1.8 million birds in the US for that species, versus palm warbler, 13 million. So again, not as big a bird of concern, but still just looking at how important our region is for both common and rare species. So in addition to Lake Michigan, these two flyways, we also have some geographical and agricultural boundaries that make Chicagoland important. And again, it's really neat to see on the map here, for example, with blackpoll warbler, you can literally kind of see where you would expect to find dense woodlands in some of these areas. And then you'll see this big absent area in Illinois. And if you compare that to a map, here's the agricultural areas in Illinois. Those are the ones in the orange color here. So this yellow color representing the lack of black and white warblers really matches up well with where the agricultural areas are. And then you can see where the birds have higher densities in Chicagoland. And of course, thinking about that they don't have places to feed over Lake Michigan as well. So again, birds coming up over that area, drop down into Chicagoland, and also going around the lake. As we talk more, we'll talk a lot about warblers in particular. So people ask, well, why are warblers so important and vulnerable? And one of the big things that makes warblers so interesting to study is that compared to sparrows, warblers really have to process a lot more food. It's research that's as much as 5 times as much food that they need to consume to get the same calories. And again, that's costing them time, even if they had an unlimited food supply, which isn't necessarily always the case. And then warblers are also a great indicator species. So because their needs are so intense, these are species we're really looking at because we would expect any dramatic changes to show up with those populations first because they have such high needs. As we talk more about some of the threats to warblers, it's important to note how important their timing is in migration. This is an older study from Graber and Graber, but I really still like it. For one, it's a specifically Illinois study, and I think it still carries the point home. Um, this black line here, the densest black line, shows the timing of warblers migrating through Illinois. These other 2 lines show the timing of when larva and larval biomass is at its highest. So this is usually specifically Lepidoptera, butterflies, and moths that these birds are feeding on. And you can see here how closely tied together the timing is of when the warblers arrive and when the food that they're feeding on is most abundant. So as we talk about this, we'll see some of the consequences when those aren't the case anymore. So that graph, that's based off the Graber and Graber study. And it also showcased that oaks held up to 60% of the warbler's food source, and even up to 90% for Tennessee warblers. So again, we definitely talk about oaks and how important they are for a lot of migrant species, not just warblers. And the study also showcased in central Illinois where food was scarce, again, thinking back to that map we showed with the agricultural areas, they were relying more on other sources like cherry trees, for example, which held as much as 12% of their food source. And as I mentioned already, Lepidoptera or moths, butterflies, species like that constituted up to 95% of the total of the invertebrate biomass that they were feeding on the forest edge foliage, especially in southern Illinois. And then it kind of went down to 75% in central Illinois. So as they got into areas with less ideal feeding, they were relying on other food sources. So with that study, it's important to note that although oaks are important, different species have very different habitat and food preferences. And some of the shrub and understory species in particular are more selective and have very specific needs. Those species also rely on a wider variety of food sources and plant species, especially in the early spring or during extreme weather events, which are increasing, and we'll see in a minute here. So again, for early arriving warblers, these are the ones that are really important to take a look at. As we talk about how much they rely on the oaks, it's important to note that the oaks don't leaf out until kind of a little bit through the spring migration when the warblers are coming through. And then the fall, they're relying on a lot of other food sources, even like berries and fruit shrub trees. And so with early arriving warblers, it's important that they have not just oaks, but also dense and diverse foliage compositions, fruit and flower bearing shrubs and trees, increased understory, and also areas that are near water or waterways. And with the water or waterways, that's often an area where we find a lot of insects and insect base, especially in the early spring before a lot of the bushes and trees start to leaf out. And then those understory areas, again, we get a lot of shrubs that will bloom earlier than trees and leaf out earlier, but it also provides protection for the warblers when they arrive in those early weeks when it's still colder, or even in May, we sometimes see snow like we're seeing right now in April.
Eric, we have a question in the chat. What physiological characteristics make the warbler have to eat so much more food for the same caloric intake?
Yeah, sure. So I'll answer that question now. I can save some for the end. But with that one, it's a very small species. They don't have a lot of body fat either. I don't know a lot of the other specifics, but I think that's part of it. Sparrows have a lot more body mass. And speaking from having done bird banding, I can tell you when you hold a warbler in your hand, it just feels so delicate. These birds have to really eat a lot to keep their energy and things going. I'm not sure if there's, migration that plays a role in that. These are very long distance migrants. So, they also have to feed a lot to refuel and continue on their migration. But that's a good question.
I would just add to that essentially they need more energy to simply stay warm because of their small size and
Mhm.
limited body fat.
Let me just make sure I'm on the right. Yep. Okay. So we wanted to highlight this. This was a study that just recently came out that a group did at Woods, and they did research looking at where migrants were feeding at the site and what features they were using. And what that study uncovered was that they were often using canopy trees, but also branches over the river and native shrubs, as well as edge and multi-layered vegetation. And what they were finding is this really validates that premise of bird-focused restoration that we need to be doing more. We can't just rely on the oaks for these species. We really need to be ensuring that we have shrub and understory layers, and that we have to make special attempts to preserve the native shrubs where they are present. And again, paying attention to restoring riverbank vegetation, creating that kind of multi-layered habitat, and protecting any existing native shrubs, as well as creating new dense brushy areas with shrub plantings. So for those who don't know about Woods, that's a spot where groups have come together to really work on replanting native shrubs where they cleared out some of the buckthorn and invasives at that site. And it's also one of the most important bird areas for migrants in Chicagoland, according to the IBAs put out by Audubon. One key takeaway from that study that I also wanted to highlight, this graph here, if you look at the bottom, that's the early weeks of spring, March 29th. And as you progress up this bar here, that goes up to May 24th. So what you'll see here is you can see all the sources of habitat that the birds are utilizing. And you'll notice that the brushy areas take up a lot of that, even up into May 10th or middle of May. And then you'll see this big shift where the migrants and especially birds like warblers and some of the tanagers and grosbeaks will start feeding on the oak trees and other trees that are leafing out. So again, it's showcasing just why that early season in particular, it's important for us to be looking at the habitat we're providing for them in those seasons. As we talk about that, another issue that's important to address is that we're seeing a lot of increases in extreme weather events. Here's a chart that's showing the number of days with precipitation of 2 inches or more over time, and this is over the past century into the 21st century. You can see how it's kind of gone up from, almost down to 100 years ago, up to almost over 2 now today. And then here's just another slide showing the same kind of data nationally. You can see this big jump from 1970 to 2020. So what kind of impact is that having on migrant birds? It often causes them to have forced landings and disrupt their migration routes. Any birds that are over Lake Michigan may be forced more to the Chicagoland shores in large numbers. So when we talk about, the big event like at McCormick Place that was in the news, that was actually the result of a very big weather event. So that was what caused many of those birds to end up dropping down right in that area as the fronts kind of move through or rain hits and cold weather hits and the birds are forced to come down instead of continue migrating. And then that weather also causes increased energy consumption. You think about the high winds and rain and cold weather and these birds that need a lot for feeding. And then also there's a sudden decrease in the food availability as well. You think about frozen water for shorebirds, and then just the lack of insects in the air when we get the cold weather and rain and things coming through. With that, I'll turn it back over to Bob. And Bob, you should be able to unmute yourself if you need to.
Eric just alluded to the fact that extreme weather events impact birds' ability to move. And this very recent study has demonstrated that quite clearly that there is a clear impact of these researchers call it sky glow. Well, basically light from incident light from buildings, metro areas, and so forth, which is a disruptive factor in migration and tends to bring birds into places where there are a lot of problems and not much opportunities in terms of seeking food. And in this case, they're talking about the influence of incident or sky glow lighting on birds that are traveling offshore. It's real and it's a large scale problem. So on to the next. And we have a place here in Chicago, famous on a lot of different levels, McCormick Place, where that same research that established the numbers of birds that pass through the Chicago wilderness area, they also pretty thoroughly defined the fact that reduced lighting had a direct benefit to the migratory birds that were passing through. They were less susceptible to being disoriented and with the consequences of that disorientation. So we have both a problem and a solution to the problem at the same time. And I think you'll probably hear more about that next week when the Bird Friendly Chicago group will be talking exactly about that subject. Go ahead, next.
Yeah,
Back
thanks,
to
Bob.
you.
So I wanted to highlight this just real quick. You know, the wildfires, that was a big one in the news. So a lot of birders have been asking questions about that. This graph here just showcases the amount of area that burned last year compared to all the years previously combined. And while this is only 1 year of data, you know, a lot of people are just starting to ask the questions, is this a trend that will continue? And will that impact these migrating birds that breed up in the boreal forests? Both from the habitat loss, but also, you know, the wildfire smoke. There's people wondering, you know, what impact does that have on birds as they're breathing that in? So that's still up in the air, you know, but it will be something that we watch in years ahead to see if it's a continuing trend or just a one-off that we had those big wildfires. As we talk about threats to migrants, the warming weather is also having impacts. Here's a slide where you can see the trends in daily average temperatures, and this is kind of per decade by season and county in Illinois. This is between 1900 and 2020. And so you can see here how much our winters are warming in Illinois, as well as to a lesser degree spring and a little bit in the fall. And winter warming really is the least ideal for migrant birds because of the impacts that we'll talk about in the upcoming slides here. One of those being that we're seeing very dramatic changes in the leaf out of the trees in Chicagoland. This map here, colors in orange, show areas where the first leaf out date for trees and shrubs is more than 8 days earlier than it was between 1950 and 1960, and comparing it to the period of 2006 and 2015. So keep in mind, this is even 10 years old data, and we're seeing more extreme things happen in the past 10 years. Blue areas represent areas where it's actually leafing out later. And then another take on that kind of same topic, this map here shows the arrival of leaves. This is more full leaf out dates, which between 1980 and 2023 is somewhere around at least 7 days earlier in Chicagoland. And then you can see some of these regions where it's as much as 28 days earlier than it was previously. And then real quick, I also wanted to showcase this year, because honestly, this has been one of the most dramatic years we've seen yet. Birders have already been troubled by the past couple of years and how early the oak trees have been leafing out, and the birds, warblers, and other migrants not arriving at the time when the Lepidoptera and the insects are hatching out and those trees are leafing out. This year, we're already, whoops, sorry about that. We're already seeing up to a 20-year early, sorry, touchpad sensitive there, up to a 20-day early leaf out. So those areas in dark red represent about 20 days early. And then this chart on the right, the dark green areas represent areas where it's a record early leaf out. And then the moderate greens are leaf outs that have only been this early every 20 to 40 years. And then the green areas, I think it's about 1 to 2 weeks, or every 1 to 4 years, sorry, that's what I was trying to say, in the light green. So even throughout the country, we're seeing a week early, and then some of these, or sorry, on the other slide, and then on this slide, up to record events. For some people, it's a 1 every 5 years. For some areas, 1 in 40 years or record leaf outs. So what are some of the impacts from those warming winters and or leaf outs on our migrant birds? Insect and Lepidoptera abundance often coincides with the warm weather and leaf out timing. So again, as we talked about, migrants aren't arriving when those species that they rely on are present. And what we're seeing is that many of these birds are not adapting to those changes in timing of the spring leaf out and food availability. Again, we've got neotropical migrants. They're coming all the way from South America sometimes even. And so their determination of when they're migrating is not always determined by what we're seeing here in our area. There's a really neat study that just came out this year by Robertson Law, and it's showing that changing green-ups strongly influenced phenological mismatches between the timing of bird migration and the timing of green-up, when things are leafing out and growing, which is highlighting that changing vegetation phenology as a potential growing threat of climate change for migratory animals is a real concern. So it's yet to see if this will change over time, but so far, we're not seeing migrants adapt to these changes that we're seeing in the leaf out. On top of climate change, another issue that migrants are facing are battling with the effects of invasive species. Obviously, this is having kind of a habitat-wide impact as well. Spongy moths and oak wilt really impacting the oak trees that the migrants are relying on. And when you combine that with climate change, our oaks are really facing a lot of trouble along with the migrant birds that feed in them. And then, thinking back to species like emerald ash borer and even Dutch elm disease, spotted lanternfly, which we're all kind of watching with bated breath to see what happens in Chicagoland as they move in. We're losing a lot of diverse species, and ash and elm trees were particularly ones that were favored by a lot of foraging migrant birds, especially in early May before the oaks leafed out. So as we lose that tree species diversity, we're also losing those spots where migrants would feed at different timings, and they're relying on oaks and looking to other sources in early spring to turn to for feeding. Land management for birds. So, what can we do to help these migrants? In a way, it's good news. The same general needs that our woodlands have to be healthy also apply for migrant birds. But, there's a lot of things that are still concerned. For example, the Illinois Natural History Survey estimates that 50 years from now, our oak regeneration won't be happening enough for it to even be the dominant species. This is an old quote, from I think 2005, but I believe there's nothing new that would change kind of that perception. And migrant birds are really impacted by that tree species diversity decline and the insect abundance, as we talked about. So what we're really seeing is, our current land management practices right now aren't enough to be combating some of the things that we're seeing. So there's a lot of questions out there for what more can we be doing to make changes and hopefully, continue to help our oaks and woodlands thrive. Some of the land management challenges, lack of understory samplings and shrubs after removal of invasives. Here's a classic picture of a recently buckthorn cleared woodland. And of course, what we're dealing with now is a woodland that's going to take time to regenerate those saplings and understory. And as far as native shrubs go, will we even see those? Many of those have been wiped out to the point where there's not banks of seeds that can even be brought back into the area. And then, of course, we're dealing with things like deer grazing on top of that. So this is a big concern for migrant birds, not having that understory layer anymore, and thinking about how long of a timeline we need to, allow these woodlands that are cleared out to naturally regenerate that full diversity of different canopy and understory vegetation. There's also been a lot of questions about insects, which are declining a lot, and some of the impacts that frequent burns might be having on that. Mesophication of woodlands, I won't get into too deeply, but as other tree species are growing in, we're getting more dense canopy cover and also wetter understory, and less of that dry leaf litter that's making woodland burns less successful and less hot, and that's causing issues as well. I wanted to bring out this one quote in particular. This is straight from the Oak Ecosystems Recovery Plan. And it says, while it's necessary to bring fire back to restore oak-dominated ecosystems, the abundance of mesic species makes controlled burning more difficult and reduce intensity of fires that do occur. Therefore, many managers burn frequently, but those frequent low-intensity burns can top kill oak seedlings and prevent development of an oak sapling layer. So, there's a lot of questions as we continue to think about where we're going forward. And we need a lot more research to kind of, answer some of these questions about what's the best interval we can be doing for burning and what are some ways we can kind of address some of these side effects. And again, this is affecting not just our woodlands, but also the birds using them. So with that, a lot of bird conservationists are really sounding an alarm call. Management and removal of understory is really far outpacing the regeneration rate of that understory. And that's leaving many migrant birds extremely vulnerable, as well as some breeding species that rely on that understory. And just showcasing that we can't rely on oaks alone for these species. So as far as protecting migrant habitat, what are some of the things that we can be doing? There's a lot of urgent broad issues that we can be tackling, but they're going to be challenging, of course. One is planting and maintaining understory vegetation as sites are cleared of invasive species. That's also beneficial because it actually helps prevent the buckthorn from reinvading the area. And of course, as we talked about, trying to figure out ways that we can continue to improve our rate of oak regeneration in their woodlands. Protecting insects from clearing and burning, what kind of impacts is that having? We talk about, people in their own yards retaining leaf litter, but we're also having to burn it out in our woodlands that we manage frequently. It would be good to researching what kind of impacts that's having. And then, of course, maintaining and enhancing tree species health and diversity, especially as we see climate change and invasive species and continue to let species be lost. It's really important that we have a diverse group of trees so that if we lose something, we still have a broad base to sustain the woodlands. And then finally, protect and enhance habitat along waterways. These are particularly important for migrants, both because they travel up those woodland corridors and there's a lot of insect base near the waterways. So this includes everything from rivers and lakes, Lake Michigan, to even just wetlands and ephemeral ponds, really areas that we want to highlight. And then some other issues kind of along with that, restoring successional habitat. Again, this is really challenging in Chicagoland. There's a lot of birds and species that really like that edge habitat, where we talk about, grasslands slowly transitioning into shrublands and then woodlands. And it's very difficult when we're working in a lot of, preserves that were previously, agricultural areas or places where they were logged or the tree line is very hard. How do we kind of bring in some of that successional habitat? And more importantly, how can we maintain it when we're dealing with, limited acreage to work with? Successional habitat being transitional by nature, it's very difficult when we have small fixed preserves to maintain that without it growing into something that's not beneficial. The lack of shrubland habitat overall is also a big concern in Chicagoland. We've got very few shrublands, a lot of grasslands, but very few shrublands for species like the black-billed cuckoo pictured here. And then, of course, just prioritizing management for birds at key sites. And if you want to look at more management recommendations, for those of you who are on the talk about the Illinois Coastal Stopover tool, I really recommend there's a nice management tab in that tool where you can go in and see some specific management recommendations for migrants at different scales of management. And then when we talk about priority sites for migrant birds, these are some of the features that really make a site important. So we're looking at sites that have diverse tree species, sites with dense understory, sites near waters we talked about. And then, of course, we kind of highlighted early on how we've got a lot of birds of concern in our woodlands, in our shrublands, and then flatlands and bottomlands are also a really important habitat. You look at areas like Bussy Woods is a good example. The nature preserve has a very high quality flatland with a lot of vernal ponds in it. And those are really great areas for migrating warblers to feed in. Sites near Lake Michigan, of course, bring their own features, and we've got a lot of birds migrating along there. Edge habitats, islands and first stops. That means, if a species is coming through a high agricultural area, they're going to see that first spot of land and they may be more likely to land down in that area. Or again, for those same reasons, that's why Lake Michigan edge lines along the shore are important for those species. And then small sites, a lot of times for small sites, they're not very beneficial for many breeding birds, but migrants will have a much smaller requirement as far as what they need. Just a series of oak trees can be really great for, a group of migrating birds passing through. Although it's not as great as a big woodland, it can serve them well compared with breeding species which just don't have enough habitat for them. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you, Bob.
Well, these clearly are the some of the larger scale questions that we have in terms of what can we learn going forward. The buckthorn removal, herbicides, insecticides, et cetera, et cetera. What's the best canopy cover, and how do we get some of those other tree species established in multivariate woodlands, and obviously some farming practices remove, shall we say, the natural contours of soil, and some restored areas require more than just simple planting, but they may require recontouring in order to restore the behavior, the water movement, and so forth across those areas. And obviously, a major question in an urban-suburban area is what effect does mosquito control have on birds? And I see a question in the chat, what do you mean by we have a lot of grasslands? A lot of our land managers in the Chicago wilderness region have focused on grassland management. So in the sort of the broad sense, we have been managing in many cases for grasslands. For example, Medewan down in Will County is being managed as a grassland to bring it back to what it once was. So go ahead on to the next, Eric. The fact is that Eric has talked about many of the problems and threats, but there is certainly a clear pattern of behavior here in the Chicago wilderness area that we're attempting, I think, successfully to respond to those threats by taking action steps. For example, the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan, which is designed to rebuild the oak forests and savannas that once were a dominant feature of the Chicago wilderness area. And there's that program is ongoing and building in momentum. We have the recent addition of Hackamattack, that 1,000 acres of what was a tree farm, but it's gradually going to be restored into an additional very large segment of natural habitat where that's sort of filling the hole in the jigsaw puzzle, which is what the Hackamattack Preserve looked like. We have the IDNR taking major league steps to protect against shoreline erosion. And if those steps work, and they've certainly spent a lot of money and time on research to find the best methods to restore and maintain our shoreline, that segment of Illinois beach shoreline is frankly the last, if you will, natural shoreline on Lake Michigan that exists in Illinois. And and their plans are very comprehensive, and they expect to be successful. And why is that important? Because not just because of perhaps nesting piping plovers, but because of the many shorebirds that travel the west edge of Lake Michigan. They need that shoreline to forage. And if we can protect it, that will be a successful way of keeping those birds moving, being well fed as they travel further north. Obviously, Medewan is a poster child for taking what was once a rather fragmented landscape and restoring it to a very large and very well-managed grassland. And frankly, the other thing is that the land management community, the forest preserve districts, the park districts, the land managers in general, there's a great deal of collaboration going on in that community. I'll point to the Chicago Wilderness Healthy Landscapes team, which is on an ongoing basis exchanging information, addressing some of the issues that Eric has mentioned in terms of land management and how to best manage for both the short term and the long term. So we are effectively making great progress. And I think that's something that we as both people who live here and as conservationists in general have to continue to support. I think, am I right, Eric? This is the last one? Nope, that's right. Power of community. I alluded to it by the professionals, but we ourselves can do a great deal. We can advocate for more funding, a very fundamental idea. For example, the statewide wetlands protection and restoration legislation, we can advocate for that right now to see that happens, not just here, but across the state. We can certainly advocate for bird-friendly policies in our local communities, and then we can employ them in our own homes where we live. We can reduce light pollution. It's going to be challenging to reduce light pollution in Chicago, but it is doable. And that will definitely help the nocturnal migrants. We can get more bird-friendly buildings and bird-friendly glass building designs in place. That takes the energy of our community to advocate for that and see that it happens. We can landscape for birds. Even small city lots may be minor oases. You might have a wood thrush in your yard for a day, but he might stay for 2 days if there's food there for him. And of course, that being said, the widespread use of so many toxic chemicals is not a good thing. So in the general sense, natural yards are better than green lawns, and hopefully we'll, as a community, we'll see more of that and less of the sort of the image of the perfect suburban weedless lawn. And of course, keep our cats indoors. Those are some of the things that we can do locally. The answer to this question is pretty simple. Can we do more to protect migratory birds? Yes. Are we doing more to protect migratory birds? Yes. So I think the needle is pointing up. Thank you very much. Thanks on behalf of the Bird Conservation Network. Thanks on behalf of Chicago Wilderness for letting us talk about these issues. This will be available the images you see will be available as a PDF, and we welcome questions both today and going up into the future. And frankly, this will be on tape, I believe, Laura, so you can look at it again, and we welcome your questions. You can simply email questions, for example, to BCN survey at bcnbirds.org to ask questions. Thank you.
So I'll go through the chat real quick, and we can walk through those if that sounds good, Laura. The first one I saw was asking about if song was I think a expender of energy for birds. I'd say yes. I don't have the specifics on how much energy expenditure that has, but I don't think it's as big a expenditure as some things. Let me see what else we've got here. Next one. We talked about grassland. Someone asked, how small is a small site? And I think that really depends on the habitat. A lot of grassland species may require bigger types of habitat. Shrubland birds are a little less particular, and woodland birds can also, it depends on the species. Some woodland birds may require 50 acres, some may only require a few acres to have a site where they can breed. But certainly, especially in habitats that you might consider otherwise low quality, not even having a lot of oak trees and things like that, but random scrub trees, maybe it's near water even, those are great sites where you might be able to benefit migrants in particular.
I would add to that our hope and plan is we're going to conduct a survey of you folks that were in attendance today. And if there's some specific element or elements within this broad spectrum of things that we talked about today that you'd like to dig into in more detail, we would be very happy to organize a more targeted discussion on one or more of the subjects within this broad, as I say, this very broad spectrum of things that you've seen today. So keep an eye out for that survey and tell us what you want to hear more about. We'll try and respond.
Thank you so much. And we love to continue this conversation. Please join us for next week's cafe on Bird Friendly Chicago. And if you have an idea for a cafe, as you can see on this slide, please contact me. We'd love to host more of these discussions. And it's pretty, we try to make it as simple as possible to be able to do that. So let me know if you have an idea for a future cafe.
Sounds good. And we can, I don't know if we have a wrap up or want to open it up for any more questions before we wrap up. How's our time, Laura?
There's a question about when next week is that cafe on Bird Friendly Chicago? That's, I believe it's April 10th, is it not, Laura?
It is April 10th at 12 noon. I'm dropping that information in the chat right now, and I'll put the link to register for it as well. Oh, sorry, I can't.
Someone asking about the magic mix. When do birds arrive? Well, birders can definitely tell you they're, if you think about warm days in spring, that's usually a time when the warblers are going to be pushing through. Um, and when you see these fallouts, what we call fallout, like the things that happened at McCormick Place, that's often when a rain front hits right as birds are trying to migrate over Chicagoland. So a warm day, they're moving north. If they hit that barrier of rain, that's often when we see the most in our area that drop down.
Just anecdotally talking about the oak ecosystem recovery plan, that initial phase of that is aimed at private landowners, and it isn't strictly based on large properties. I learned that my property could be eligible for some help in building out the oaks that I already have and making sure that where I live becomes a more what it once was than what it is today. So look into the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan. Go to their website for some details on that as well. If you have a piece of wooded property, there may be some help available there.
I see we're at some questions asked about Chicagoland and McCormick Place. Bob, we can give a quick update, but I believe that the April 10th talk will go into a lot more detail about that. So I don't want to speak too deeply to that specific issue. It sounds like things are happening with McCormick Place, and City of Chicago is a whole other topic too. I think they'll kind of talk about in the April 10th talk.
Yeah, please join
And
us.
then-
Please join us for that cafe. Here's the registration link here.
I see one other question, the 75-kilometer transect or corridor that was the base of the Van Doren paper. By the way, I think he was in the audience, the principal author, Benjamin Van Doren, and he's now part of the University of Illinois faculty, and he has been very heavily involved in bird migration research. So he will be a real asset to the Chicago wilderness community going forward. But the 75K corridor is a transect, and actually the Fox River corridor is important, but it's largely outside of that 75-kilometer transect. It's further away.
Yeah, so that study area was kind of a specific area, and it would be neat to see a comparison of how many migrants are out, in the suburbs with a similar study. I live along the Fox River, so I definitely can attest to, again, we talk about all those corridors, both birds following the waterways, but also the preserved habitat. Chicagoland's got a lot of great preserved habitat along our rivers, which are often north and south as well. So we see a lot of migrants that move up along those corridors in the spring and the fall. If there aren't any more questions popping up, I think we can kind of turn it back over to you, Laura. And I put my email in the chat as well, and people can reach out if they have additional questions. They can find us through bcmbirds.org as well if they want to reach out through there and ask questions for us as well. I'll mention real quick too the migrant bird habitat study. That's an old document that's on our website that gives a really detailed list of types of shrubs and tree species that migrants enjoy that you can plant. I believe that was something that someone had asked about. And then if you're doing restoration, the local bird groups, someone asked about a site in Chicago. I encourage you to reach out to, Chicago Ornithological Society, Chicago Bird Alliance, Audubon Great Lakes, all those groups. They've got a wealth of knowledge on, those specific sites even and what you can be doing there as you're doing restoration work.
Yeah, we didn't talk about it, but the BCN Coalition is a group of 21 different organizations, many of which are very local. Audubon Great Lakes, Eric has mentioned Chicago Bird Collision Monitors, many of the Illinois Audubon Society chapters that are up here. And our goal is to work, we are a community ourselves of people who all care about making the Chicago wilderness area as good as it gets for the birds that live here and the birds that migrate through.
I wanted to answer this. That's a heated question. Should you keep buckthorn understory until land manager is ready with native shrubs to replace them? I think that'd be a hot topic question. I think definitely our concern is that the rate we're removing buckthorn is troubling us, that we don't have the resources to plant native shrubs that we want to. I'm not going to be the person to say don't cut out buckthorn, but I think we want to really think about where we're prioritizing buckthorn removal. If you have an area that's really migrant dense and heavy, we're really encouraging people to prioritize shrubland planting in those areas first, that can be a priority area for us to do that native restoration. And then, maybe you're focusing on those deep oak woodlands first, where you're clearing out. And some of those, lesser quality habitats, maybe you're tackling those last as you're doing restoration work. Migrants use buckthorn, it's not as good as the native habitat and the food source isn't as great, but they are using it and we do have species, relying on it. So, how do we address that? I think it's a big question, requires ongoing discussion for, what we can do to ensure that we're not ending up with no understory or a lack of understory, because it will take time for that, natural canopy to regrow and for us to develop that.
Yeah, there's one other question, is mowing every fall of natural areas a recommended practice or not? That still continues to be unclear as to whether mowing or burning and the intervals thereof are sometimes our worldview is a little bit too short term, and it takes time to gather enough data to find out what is the best ongoing management technique. So I don't think there's any simple answer. I would say that mowing is done sometimes in place of burning, but it isn't recommended as kind of a buzzword in that context.
Yeah, I'll say I monitor a grassland in Cook County that's got a ton of bobolinks, and it's an area that was historically hayfields, and now the Cook County Forest Preserve District is continuing to try and mow and maintain that habitat, of course, avoiding the breeding season. But it is something that I think a lot more research is needed, and BCN's actually doing a kind of pilot grassland study right now to look at where our grassland birds are doing well and what are some of the common features. And that's one of the things we're taking a look at. So Cook County's done a great job of trying to maintain that habitat. So I think there's some places where we're trying different techniques and we're still in that stage of trying to see and figure out what works best in different places. As far as chemicals, someone asked about that. Um, Again, that's another area where I think we need more research. There's a lot of varied research. Some people say it's not impacting insects, for example. There's other research that says it can impact Lepidoptera and insects. I think for us, that's one of the most concerning potential issues. But again, it's still kind of a lot of mixed evidence out there.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today. And Eric, just share the PDF of the slides with me and I will get those posted on our website with the recording as soon as possible. It will be most likely by Monday, folks. If you want to check back on Monday on the website link that I shared, we'll try to get up there by then. Lake and I will work together to get those materials together. So thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.